On Yaya Prime, Deck, a smaller than average hunter, is practicing. He utilizes various gadgets to navigate the terrain before entering a cavern where his sensors indicate his sibling is concealed close by. Deck lunges from the rear with his blade, but Key parries it at the last second. They start dueling, and Key mocks Deck while they shift positions, advising him to utilize the cavern's layout. Their blades continue to strike against each other as they traverse the cavern, and after trading numerous strikes, Key traps Deck but spares his life. When Deck declines to surrender, Key slices through the columns supporting them, sending Deck tumbling into the chasm. He succeeds in rescuing himself by grabbing the cliff face. He scales the wall and strikes at Key once more. Afterward, aboard their vessel, Key informs Deck that he must select a target to secure his spot within the Yaya tribe. Deck desires to travel to Jenna, dubbed the Planet of Death, to stalk the invincible beast, the Callisk. Even their dad is afraid of it, which is precisely the reason Deck wishes to pursue it. He is exhausted by his father viewing him as frail. Key disagrees. Nevertheless, Deck swears his oath. Just then, their patriarch, Injar, arrives, and Deck greets him respectfully with a blood offering. Injar questions Deck's survival, disclosing that he commanded Key to terminate him for being too feeble to join the tribe. Yet, Key believes Deck merits an opportunity to demonstrate his worth. A furious Injar hurls a gadget that restrains Deck and orders Key to execute him immediately. But rather than complying, Key releases him and uses his beam to push him onto the vessel. Subsequently, Key deploys his barrier to defend his sibling, as Injar begins shooting. Following the sealing of the ship to prevent Deck's exit, Key engages Injar in combat and, within a few maneuvers, succeeds in removing his weapon. Injar engages his stealth masking, yet Key continues striking. Injar pierces his hand prior to severing his arm. Then, Injar knocks his offspring to the ground, and Key begins dragging himself away, grasping for his limb instead of his blade. Injar labels him feeble and impales him. Consequently, Key utilizes his final moment to trigger the vessel so his sibling can travel to Jenna. Deck observes Injar injure Key's neck as the vessel's takeoff renders him unconscious. A while later, Deck is roused by a warning siren. The craft has sustained damage from orbital junk and is plummeting toward Jenna. Deck hurries to the pilot chair and ejects, causing it to drop rapidly through the atmosphere of Jenna. When an avian creature nearly collides with him, he engages the barrier. He eventually impacts within the forest and bellows in annoyance. Resolute in locating the beast, Deck checks his arsenal to ensure all equipment is functional. He is spooked by a sound close by and begins scanning the zone. Unexpectedly, a tendril-like entity ambushes him and pilfers one of his armaments. Deck prepares his blade, but another tendril seizes his limb, forcing him to sever it as the initial one gets away. Regrettably, additional tendrils emerge and extend toward him until they latch onto his lower limb to pull him across the dirt. Deck succeeds in grabbing his projectile weapon to fire at his abductor, compelling it to release him, and strikes the tendril to repel it. Subsequently, Deck sprints to recover his blade and rapidly cuts the vines that continue to assault him. Regardless of the number he severs, however, increasingly more appear, and they even begin coordinating their strikes. Deck rapidly evades several attacks and leaps onto a tendril to sprint along it, assisting him in reaching a precipice's peak. The vines are unable to touch him at that height. And now, Deck possesses a clear vantage point of the world, which appears frightening. Later, Deck cleans his injury in the stream and utilizes his sensor to locate a healing herb that can double as an explosive. Upon a frond, he discovers a grub that begins developing crimson orbs, and when he tosses it, it detonates. Next, he sets out to investigate and look for the Callisk. In a large meadow, he encounters peculiar crimson flora that continuously hiss in his direction. Consequently, he proceeds with caution to evade them. Just then, Deck detects a voice speaking an alien tongue and gazes upward to spot Thea snare within a massive roost. Understanding he cannot comprehend her, Thea switches to a common dialect, revealing she is a robot, referred to as a synthetic. Abruptly, a Jenna vulture manifests close by and clutches a stone to hurl at the odd vegetation. This causes the capsules to burst with crimson fumes and fire their spikes, which Deck rapidly sidesteps. Thea clarifies that the spikes can immobilize him, allowing the bird to consume him. When Thea proposes assistance, Deck states that his people hunt solitary, and Thea surmises he has arrived for the Callisk. The bird hurls additional stones, and numerous flora are triggered, resulting in Deck being struck by the spikes. As he begins to feel lightheaded, Thea requests an armament, so he flings one of his knives to her prior to falling down. The bird swoops down and is preparing to devour him when Thea charges the creature and violently slays it with the knife. Deck witnesses her signal him before losing consciousness. A short time later, Deck revives because Thea has administered a cure created from the identical bloom. Deck rises and assists Thea in standing, only to observe that she lacks the lower portion of her form. She clarifies she is a synthetic, dispatched by the Way and Utani Company since people cannot survive on this world, yet Deck is indifferent and lets her fall. Thea then notes that numerous of his kind have arrived for the beast and zero lived, yet she has. If he brings her along, she will lead him to the monster's lair. In this manner, she retrieves her limbs and he secures his prize. Deck understands it was the beast that wrecked her, yet he remains unenthusiastic. Nevertheless, when Thea refers to herself as a helpful implement, Deck no longer views it as violating his creed and consents to transport her. As they journey, Thea speaks incessantly and continues posing inquiries. By the stream, certain strange grubs start firing corrosive fluid at them. Therefore, Deck hoists Thea onto his shoulders to sprint more quickly. Regrettably, he discovers the path obstructed, and Thea utilizes the opportunity to instruct him. She tosses an adhesive produce onto the soil, and the beasts hurry to consume it. Currently, they have ceased firing. After they depart the stream area, Deck severs a cluster of creepers and binds Thea to his rear to travel with greater ease. At dusk, they pause to rest for the evening, and Deck utilizes his gadget for illumination. Thea reveals that her team landed on Jenna 2 years prior, and she was stuck in the bird's roost for nearly a fortnight. She had anticipated that a different android named Tessa would rescue her, and informs Deck that they possess greater empathy than other versions. Deck views empathy as a flaw. Yet, Thea believes it is a benefit for comprehending other beings. Thea was previously confined to the laboratory, but one afternoon, Tessa took her outside to investigate. Regrettably, that was the same day the monster assaulted them. Concurrently, at the team's fresh outpost, it is disclosed that Tessa appears identical to Thea. She sustained critical injuries during the beast's assault. Thus, presently she is inside a capsule undergoing restoration. Tessa continues chanting Thea's moniker and recalling the event, so the system alerts her that her main objective is to capture the beast. The system also identifies the existence of a warrior and categorizes him as a danger. When Tessa eventually revives, she is informed that Thea was taken by the warrior. At dawn, Dek leaves to forage for sustenance. He encounters a bone bison, which is typically prey for the monster. Dek attempts to advance, but is forced to retreat when he finds that this meadow is blanketed in sharp blades of grass. Just as Dek prepares to hurl his weapon, a tiny beast leaps from a branch and touches down beside the pair. Thea is unable to recognize it, and Dek bellows at it, yet the small one simply bellows in return. Then the animal begins pursuing the bison without difficulty, since its tough hide is unaffected by the sharp grass. Angered by the rivalry, Dek begins leaping between trees to pursue the bison as well. The mass snaps a limb, and the pair drops. Consequently, Dek impales the trunk with his sword and halts their descent just before they contact the hazardous turf. When the bison sprints close to them, Dek leaps onto it and pierces it. Nevertheless, the bison bucks them off by utilizing another trunk. The tiny animal tumbles in front of them, and an annoyed Dek intercepts it to initiate a brawl, resulting in Thea frequently getting crushed. The small one possesses unexpected power, yet after a brief tussle, Dek succeeds in seizing it by the throat. Just then, the bison charges in their direction. Thus, Dek hurls his blade and keeps the bison's jaws apart as the weapon continues to slice it in two. Dek shouts to commemorate a triumphant kill, but a feeler abruptly seizes his limb and hoists him. The pair has been snared by a lunabug, whose constricting tongue feeler prevents Dek from triggering his gadgets. As they are on the verge of being devoured, the tiny beast leaps into the lunabug's maw and jams its fangs with its durable hide, shattering them. The lunabug is in such agony that it ejects them and departs by traversing the sharp grass. Eager for vengeance, Dek fells a tree to utilize as a span. The small animal is already tumbling down the meadow, and the lunabug seizes it with its tongue. But right then, Dek touches down on its cranium. He impales the beast with his blade and inflicts a massive wound that ultimately terminates it. Concurrently, Tessa and her team of robots are hunting for Thea. They locate Dek's capsule before being assaulted by the tendrils. The team rapidly shoots to retard their advance. Subsequently, they trigger their incendiary weapons to incinerate all the creepers. At dusk, Dek and Thea set up camp once more. The tiny animal continues trailing them and mimicking every action of Dek, as it is awed by his method of killing the bison. Thea calls it Bud, while Dek distributes the cooked flesh. Thea inquires about Dek's kin, so he recounts the events regarding his sibling and dad, yet he declines to admit he is mourning when Thea applies that term. He notes that Tessa qualifies as her sibling, and Thea appreciates the idea. During the night, Tessa and her team discovered Dek's vessel, which wrecked after he ejected. There are numerous alien armaments that Tessa deems intriguing, including an explosive that chills her hand. The following dawn, Dek seizes Thea and departs excluding Bud, maintaining that he stalks prey solo, and Thea is exempt because she is an instrument. Thea informs him regarding wolves and their pack hunting methods, noting that the leader isn't the most prolific hunter, but the protector of the group. Dek fails to grasp the lesson and claims he will be the leader with the highest kill count. Following the discovery of a monster's tooth by the stream, the pair proceeds in that bearing and arrives at Thea's outpost, which has been totally obliterated by the creature. Amid scores of robotic corpses, Thea locates her lower limbs. Fortunately, the fixing apparatus remains functional, and she can utilize it to reattach her two segments, though the operation will require time. She expresses gratitude to Dek for his assistance, but also says sorry and orders him to depart since she has triggered the signal to summon her team. Thea clarifies that her squad is also pursuing the beast, so she cannot permit him to slay it. Dek declines to go, stating he would prefer to fall with dignity than flee like a craven. Within the debris, there is leaked fuel, so Dek ignites it to generate a plume of smoke. The Callisk shortly emerges and knocks Dek over, impairing his blade. Dek utilizes a scrap of steel as a guard and glides beneath the beast to cut its abdomen. Then he hurls his dagger at its cranium and severs its tail. Nevertheless, the tail rapidly regenerates and the injuries seal due to the creature possessing healing abilities, clarifying why it is deemed invincible. The beast seizes Dek and hurls him into the fixing device, causing Thea's limbs to tumble from the platform. When it clutches him once more, Dek slices its tongue to liberate himself. The battle persists, and Dek must evade numerous strikes while Thea attempts to recover her limbs. Just then, she spots a firearm on the floor and shoots at the monster to divert it. Dek seizes the opportunity to fling a tether at the beast's maw and triggers a device that begins retracting the tether, hauling the creature backward. Then, Dek grabs Thea's weapon and begins firing. When the beast strikes at him with its tail, Dek sidesteps and shuts a cargo bay hatch to snare it. At this point, he can sprint up the creature's form and execute a massive leap over its cranium to effectively cut off its head. Unfortunately, this remains insufficient to slay it, and the head rapidly reconnects to the torso. The Callisk pins Dek with its large claw and scents him. The odor it detects stops it from striking. The instant is disrupted when Tessa lobs an explosive to freeze both Dek and the beast, so she can apprehend them. A while afterward, Dek revives restrained to a slab within the team's transport. Thea is in standby state as she is linked to the mending device, and Tessa has reviewed her entire record. She fails to comprehend why Dek survives, as his people typically eliminate frail offspring, and remarks that being property of her corporation ought to be a privilege for him. Then Tessa rouses Thea and commends her for acquiring two subjects. She administers an agonizing shot to Dek to test on him. Thus, Thea attempts to tactfully rescue him by noting he is a runt, and thus unsuitable for research. She suggests they retain his armaments and release Dek. Tessa insists on a specimen, so she attaches two wires to his skull that induce significant agony. A frantic Thea powers down the device and informs Tessa they ought to be greater than automatons that merely obey commands. Indeed, she desires for them to be siblings. Nevertheless, Tessa discloses she did not return to save Thea. she arrived for the beast. She concurs with the alien custom of discarding the frail and labels Thea defective. Right then, Tessa receives a communication from Earth. Thus, she exits to answer it after commanding a sentry to crate Thea. Because the individual cannot speak the alien tongue, Dek requests Thea to compel him to open one of his gadgets. Thea informs the sentry that Dek's gadget is a chart, and upon opening it, his skull detonates. Subsequently, Thea liberates Dek and a siren is tripped, causing additional sentries to arrive and shoot at him. Thea unseals the rear exit, and Dek leaps into a cascade to get away. Later on, Dek locates his wrecked vessel and tends to his injuries. Yet, there are 0 armaments remaining. He thinks about departing the world, but he gazes at his siblings' headgear and recalls that the superior wolf is the one who defends the group. Dek goes back to the forest and begins collecting environmental hazards to utilize as arms, such as shards of sharp grass and the thorns from the crimson blooms. He also acquires the corrosive grub using the produce. While laboring, he encounters Bud and scents its saliva. He ultimately understands that Bud is the beast's offspring, and he was not killed because he smelled similar, so Dek coats Bud with his own saliva instead. Finally, he releases Thea's limbs so he can trail them to their proprietor. At the fresh outpost, Dek emerges donning the bison skeletal remains as protection and hurls corrosive fluid at a sentry to incapacitate him. The limbs track a transmission from Thea, who is dormant inside a crate. When 2 sentries attempt to strike the limbs, Dek rapidly vanquishes them with a lash constructed from creepers and sharp grass. Bud also assists by demolishing a sentry in moments. The pair continues creeping through the facility, taking out any sentry in their path so the limbs can proceed without pauses. Concurrently, Tessa is speaking with the corporation and states they will return shortly with the beast. When questioned regarding Dek, she informs them that he is deceased. Using his assortment of organic armaments, Dek continues wrecking robotic sentries, occasionally battling several simultaneously. Within a research room, a sentry succeeds in trapping him, so Dek shatters a glass enclosure and allows a creeper specimen to slay him instead. When the limbs locate the crate, they leap onto a sentry's throat and rapidly execute him prior to unsealing the receptacle. Thea revives and rejoices, but she detects sentries approaching, so she feigns sleep once more. The limbs strike a sentry to knock him down, and Thea leaps out to combat him, while the limbs engage the second individual. Both physical segments assist one another in the fight, and when a sentry prepares to strike the limbs, they leap clear, and the impact ruins the other robot held by Thea. Next, she raises a tiny mechanical component, and the limbs shove the last sentry's cranium onto it to terminate him as well. Shortly, Dek discovers the crate also, yet it is vacant. A sentry ambushes him from the rear, only for Thea to slay him with a blast. Her segments are at last reunited, and she is astonished to view Dek, who confesses he returned for her, similar to a noble wolf. Thea desires to depart, but Dek declares they have to liberate the beast so Bud can reunite with its parent. Abruptly, a siren sounds, and Tessa orders her troops to accelerate the takeoff of the vessel containing the creature. While she investigates, a squad of fighters locates Dek, who triggers the explosive grubs to generate a substantial blast that annihilates all the robots simultaneously. Subsequently, Tessa emerges within a combat exoskeleton and fires at Dek with a beam she pilfered from his craft, which slays his corrosive grub. She utilizes the exoskeleton to collapse buildings and withdraws a massive cutter, yet Dek evades everything. In the primary vessel, Thea attempts to reach the beast, but the enclosure is secured. When a sentry passes, she is unsuccessful in mimicking Tessa, so she crushes the individual's skull against the enclosure instead. Next, she utilizes his oculars to release the mechanism. When an assault hurls Dek into the research room, the exoskeleton's arm descends and is ensnared by the animated creeper. Dek attempts to scale it, but Tessa instantly flings him away, so he conceals himself behind a crate. Tessa raises it, but fails to spot him. It appears he has scaled the crate to position himself over her. Currently, Dek can leap onto Tessa to batter her, but she rapidly seals the pilot station. Unexpectedly, the beast emerges and bounds onto the exoskeleton, so Tessa engages the cutter to impale it and hoist it. While she is preoccupied, Dek scales the rear of the exoskeleton and begins tearing wires to retard its movement. Tessa hurls an explosive at the beast, but Dek strikes it with a steel bar, causing it to land on the exoskeleton's limb, so the frost causes it to release the creature. The creature extracts the cutter from its form and assaults the exoskeleton, cleaving it in half. When the top portion impacts the ground, the beast eats Tessa and bellows in triumph. The remaining group rejoins Dek, and they observe the beast inspect its offspring. They partake in a tender instant, and Dek is motivated to demonstrate his admiration for the beast as well by nudging foreheads. Abruptly, the beast detonates due to a frost explosive triggered by Tessa, who survived within the creature's gut. She rises from the debris and attempts to strike Thea, only for Dek to impale her from the rear, ultimately slaying her. He reclaims his gadget, and Bud tears off her cranium. A while afterward, Dek goes back to Ya and offers Tessa's head to his dad. Nyar continues to view him as a shame and dispatches 2 sentries to execute him, but Dek acts quickly and effortlessly slays them beforehand. Then Dek combats Nyar, who conceals himself with his stealth masking. Dek triggers the vessel's thruster to generate a dust cloud that permits him to spot his father's position and severs his arm to halt him. Next, he snares him using a prison gadget. When Dek ceremonially pierces his father's headgear, Injar removes it and states that Dek may enter the tribe if he yields. Nevertheless, Dek replies he already possesses a tribe before a mature Bud devours Njar's head. Thea commends him while Dek claims his father's masking gear. Right then, a different vessel emerges and Dek remarks it is his mom. Ensure you follow and enable alerts so you are able to view additional clips similar to this. Appreciate your viewing.